The history of Africa did not start after colonization. It started long ago, about 5,000 years, as the birthplace of human civilization. The empires, the kings, the gods, the evolution, and many will be discussed in this African documentary. The pharaoh was supported by a hierarchy of officials, scribes, and governors, ensuring efficient collection of taxes, coordination of labor, and oversight of agricultural production. It was during this period that Egypt earned the moniker the Age of the Pyramids, as monumental structures such as the Great Pyramid of Giza, built by Pharaoh Khufu, circa 2580 to 2560 BCE, and the pyramids of Khafre and Menkaure symbolize the pharaoh's divine authority and the society's engineering prowess. These constructions required careful planning, sophisticated mathematics, and the mobilization of thousands of workers, revealing a civilization capable of large-scale organization and state-driven innovation. Beyond architecture, the Old Kingdom was marked by advances in art, religion, and literature. The development of hieroglyphic writing, emerging around c. 3100 BCE, allowed Egypt to maintain records of administrative activities, religious texts, and monumental inscriptions. Funerary culture, exemplified by elaborate tombs and the cult of the afterlife, reflected both religious belief and social hierarchy. The pharaoh's tomb was not merely a resting place, but a testament to the interconnectedness of politics, religion, and labor in Egyptian society. By the end of the Old Kingdom, however, centralized power weakened due to droughts, declining Nile floods, and internal rebellions, ushering in the First Intermediate Period, circa 2181 to 2055 BCE, a time of political fragmentation and local rule. The Middle Kingdom, circa 2055 to 1650 BCE, saw the reunification of Egypt under pharaohs such as Mentuhotep II, restoring stability and central authority. This period was characterized by significant cultural and economic expansion. Trade networks extended into Nubia to the south, the Levant to the northeast, and the Red Sea coast, exchanging gold, ebony, incense, and other valuable resources. Art and literature flourished, with works such as the Story of Sinew, reflecting both the values of loyalty and the intellectual sophistication of the period. Technological advances in irrigation and land reclamation improved agricultural productivity, allowing the state to support a growing population and maintain an expanding bureaucracy. The Middle Kingdom set a precedent for statecraft, culture, and trade that would influence subsequent Egyptian dynasties. By c. 1550 BCE, Egypt entered its new kingdom, circa 1550 to 1070 BCE, a period widely regarded as the civilization's zenith. Following the expulsion of the Hyksos invaders from the Nile Delta, Egypt became a formidable military power, projecting influence into Nubia, the Levant, and even as far as the Near East. The pharaohs of this period, including Hatshepsut, circa 1479 to 1458 BCE, Akhenaten, circa 1353 to 1336 BCE, and Ramses II, circa 1279 to 1213 BCE, are remembered for both their monumental building programs and ambitious campaigns. Hatshepsut, one of Egypt's few female pharaohs, is renowned for her trading expedition to the land of Punt, circa 1490 BCE, which brought back exotic goods such as incense, myrrh, and ebony, highlighting Egypt's extensive maritime trade networks. Akhenaten, meanwhile, introduced profound religious reforms, promoting the worship of Aten, the sun disk, in what is now known as the Amarna period. Ramses II, often called the Great, expanded Egypt's territory through campaigns in Canaan and Nubia and commissioned monumental temples, including Abu Simbel, demonstrating the intertwining of military prowess, religious devotion, and state propaganda. During the New Kingdom, Egyptian society was highly stratified. The pharaoh occupied the apex of power, followed by a class of high officials, scribes, priests, and artisans. The majority of the population consisted of farmers, laborers, and craftsmen, whose work underpinned the wealth and stability of the state. Religion remained central to everyday life, with gods such as Amuniasare, Osiris, and Isis embodying cosmic order and societal values. Funerary practices, including mummification and the construction of elaborate tombs in the Valley of the Kings, reflected beliefs about the afterlife and reinforced social hierarchies. The late period, c. 664 to 332 BCE, was marked by foreign domination and political instability. Egypt fell under the control of the Assyrians, Persians, and eventually the Greeks. Despite these challenges, the civilization maintained its cultural identity, continuing to produce art, literature, and monumental architecture. The pharaohs of this era attempted to balance traditional religious and political practices with the realities of foreign rule. This period ultimately concluded with the conquest of Egypt by Alexander the Great in 332 BCE, signaling the end of pharaonic sovereignty and the beginning of Hellenistic influence. However, even under foreign rule, Egyptian traditions endured, demonstrating the resilience and continuity of this civilization. Egypt's contributions to global history are vast. It pioneered writing, monumental architecture, centralized administration, and state-organized agriculture. Its religious, artistic, and scientific achievements influenced neighboring regions, from Nubia to the Near East, and left a lasting legacy that continues to shape our understanding of ancient civilizations. Trade along the Nile, Red Sea, and Mediterranean facilitated cultural exchange, while technological innovations in irrigation, metallurgy, and construction set benchmarks for societies worldwide. The story of ancient Egypt is not merely the story of pharaohs and pyramids. It is the story of a civilization that integrated governance, religion, technology, and culture into a sustainable system that endured for millennia. Egypt's trajectory, from the unification of the Nile Valley under Narmer to the twilight of pharaonic rule under foreign conquest, demonstrates the delicate balance between environmental opportunity, political authority, and social cohesion. It exemplifies how geography, innovation, and leadership converge to create enduring civilizations. Importantly, Egypt's history cannot be viewed in isolation. Its interactions with Nubia to the south, Levantine city-states to the northeast, and later Mediterranean empires illustrate the interconnectedness of African and global history. Trade, warfare, diplomacy, and cultural exchange formed the networks that sustained Egypt's prosperity and influenced the development of neighboring societies. The rise of the Nubian kingdoms, the spread of metallurgy, and the early movements of peoples along the Nile and Sahara are all entwined with Egypt's narrative, establishing a broader African context that underscores the continent's complexity long before recorded history elsewhere. By the time of its conquest by Alexander the Great, Egypt had established a civilization whose accomplishments were unparalleled in the ancient world. Its achievements in architecture, writing, governance, art, and religion formed the foundation for subsequent African civilizations and influenced the Mediterranean world, including Greece and Rome. Egypt demonstrates that African societies were among the earliest and most sophisticated in human history, capable of producing enduring cultural, technological, and political legacies. While ancient Egypt dominates much of the early narrative of recorded African history, its southern neighbor, Nubia, developed its own complex and enduring civilizations, forming a crucial part of the Nile Valley's historical tapestry. The region of Nubia, encompassing what is today northern Sudan and southern Egypt, was home to several powerful kingdoms that rose contemporaneously with and later succeeded Egypt in regional influence. By c. 2500 BCE, the Kingdom of Kerma, circa 2500 to 1500 BCE, had emerged as a centralized polity capable of mobilizing labor, organizing military forces, and engaging in long-distance trade. Kerma's power was built upon its strategic position along the Nile, controlling the flow of goods such as gold, ebony, ivory, and incense between sub-Saharan Africa and Egypt. Kerma's society was highly stratified. Archaeological evidence from its capital, Kerma, reveals monumental structures, including the famed Defufa, massive mud brick temples used for religious ceremonies, and elaborate tombs for rulers, reflecting both wealth. This technological prowess allowed Meroe to sustain political independence, even as Egyptian and later Ptolemaic influence waned. While Nubia rose in the Nile Valley, across the Mediterranean coast, another African civilization emerged with a markedly different trajectory. Carthage, founded by Phoenician settlers from Tyre in 814 BCE, developed into a dominant maritime power. Located in modern-day Tunisia, Carthage controlled key trade routes in the western Mediterranean, establishing colonies across North Africa, Sardinia, Sicily, and southern Spain. Its strategic position enabled it to exploit resources such as grain, silver, and purple dye, while its powerful navy safeguarded its trade networks and extended its influence far beyond the North African coast. Carthage's political system was a complex combination of monarchy and republican institutions. The city was ruled by Safetes, judges or executives, a council of elders, and assemblies that allowed for considerable civic participation among the elite. The Carthaginian economy was heavily mercantile, with a focus on maritime trade, manufacturing, and agriculture. Its society was also deeply religious, with worship of deities such as Baal-Hamon and Tanit, and elaborate ritual practices, including offerings, and as some evidence suggests, occasional human sacrifice, a practice documented primarily by Greek and Roman sources, though still debated among scholars. Carthage's ambition inevitably led to conflict with Rome, culminating in the Punic Wars, 264 to 146 BCE, a series of three protracted conflicts that would shape the course of Mediterranean history. The First Punic War, 264 to 241 BCE, arose over control of Sicily, where Carthage's maritime strength initially allowed it to dominate naval engagements, though Rome ultimately adapted with innovative military engineering, securing Sicily as its first province. The Second Punic War, 218 to 201 BCE, is particularly famous for Hannibal Barca's audacious crossing of the Alps with war elephants, an event that remains emblematic of military genius and strategic daring. Despite Hannibal's early victories at Trebia, 218 BCE, Lake Trasimene, 217 BCE, and Cannae, 216 BC, Carthage's inability to secure adequate reinforcements and Rome's strategic resilience led to Hannibal's eventual defeat and the Treaty of Zama in 201 BCE. The Third Punic War, 149 to 146 BCE, ended with the destruction of Carthage, its population enslaved, and its territory annexed as the Roman province of Africa. This marked the end of Carthaginian political independence, but not the disappearance of its cultural and economic influence. The histories of Nubia and Carthage, though geographically distant, share key characteristics with other African civilizations. Both developed complex urban centers, hierarchical societies, and extensive trade networks, demonstrating a level of social and political sophistication that rivaled contemporaneous civilizations in Mesopotamia, Greece, and Persia. Nubia and Carthage also illustrate the diversity of African civilizations. The Nile Valley kingdoms relied on riverine agriculture, monumental architecture, and religious centrality, while Carthage leveraged maritime trade, commerce, and mercantile governance to exert influence across the Mediterranean. Trade, in particular, was central to both regions. Nubia's gold, ivory, and exotic animals were highly prized commodities for Egypt and later Mediterranean powers. Carthage's control of maritime routes facilitated the exchange of metals, grains, and luxury goods across North Africa and the Western Mediterranean. These networks not only enriched their economies, but also facilitated the transmission of technology, ideas, and cultural practices, making Nubia and Carthage integral players in a larger Afro-Mediterranean system long before the rise of European colonial powers. Religion and ideology also shaped governance and identity in these civilizations. In Nubia, rulers were often considered divine or semi-divine figures, reflecting the enduring influence of Egyptian religious models. Temples and pyramids were constructed to honor gods and secure the pharaoh's place in the afterlife, paralleling the social and spiritual centrality of religion in maintaining political authority. Carthage, by contrast, emphasized civic religion intertwined with mercantile and military obligations. Religious festivals, temple offerings, and ritual sacrifices reinforced elite authority, societal cohesion, and divine favor for commercial and military endeavors. Moreover, both regions face cycles of conflict and renewal that highlight the dynamic nature of African history. Nubia oscillated between independence and subjugation under Egypt, adapting its strategies, culture, and administration to survive and thrive. Carthage repeatedly engaged in war with neighboring powers, demonstrating both strategic innovation and economic resilience until its ultimate destruction. These patterns underscore a broader theme in African history. Societies constantly negotiated power, resources, and external pressures while maintaining cultural continuity and regional influence. By 146 BCE, when Carthage was destroyed, Nubia's Meroitic kingdom had already established itself as a resilient African polity capable of withstanding external pressures and sustaining a unique cultural identity. Meanwhile, the legacy of Carthage continued to influence Roman North Africa, Mediterranean trade, and urban development for centuries. Together, Nubia, Kush, and Carthage demonstrate that African civilizations were deeply interconnected, regionally diverse, and globally influential long before the rise of European imperial powers. In examining the histories of Nubia, Kush, and Carthage, it becomes clear that Africa's narrative is not solely defined by Egypt. These civilizations illustrate the continent's political complexity, technological innovation, economic networks, and cultural sophistication, establishing patterns of governance, trade, and social organization that would inform later African empires. They also highlight the resilience and adaptability of African societies, showing how communities navigated environmental challenges, external threats, and internal dynamics to create enduring legacies. These civilizations, flourishing centuries before the Roman conquest of the Mediterranean, laid the groundwork for the trans-Saharan trade networks, the rise of West African empires, and the continuation of African influence in global history. As the centuries passed in North Africa and along the Nile, West Africa was quietly developing its own complex societies and trade networks. The vast Sahelian and Savannah regions, stretching from the Atlantic coast to the Niger River, became home to states that thrived on control of gold, salt, and agricultural resources. Among the earliest and most influential of these states was the Ghana Empire, c. 300 to 1200 CE, not to be confused with modern Ghana. Centered in what is today southeastern Mauritania and western Mali, the empire rose to prominence due to its strategic position between the Sahara Desert and the forests of West Africa, controlling trade routes that connected North African traders with sub-Saharan gold sources. The origins of the Ghana Empire are complex, blending local matrilineal clan leadership with emerging centralized authority. By c. 750 CE, Ghana had evolved into a sophisticated state with a king, known as the Ghana or war chief, wielding both military and political power. The empire maintained a standing army to defend its borders, secure trade routes, and enforced tribute from subordinate towns and clans. Its capital, Kumbhi-Sala, became a bustling center, divided into two sections, one for the king and court, and another for merchants and traders. The king's authority was both secular and spiritual, as he was seen as a custodian of the land and the divine guarantor of prosperity. Ghana's wealth derived primarily from gold, abundant in the forests to the south, and its control over the trans-Saharan trade. Salt, imported from the Saharan salt mines such as Tagaza and other goods, including ivory, kola nuts, and slaves, were exchanged for gold, textiles, and manufactured items from North Africa and the Mediterranean. This trade attracted Muslim merchants from the Maghreb, who brought not only goods but also literacy, mathematics, and Islam. By c. 1076 CE, the empire faced pressure from the Almoravids, a North African Berber Muslim movement, which challenged Ghana's dominance. Though the Almoravid conquest destabilized the empire, Ghana's legacy laid the groundwork for subsequent West African states, demonstrating how strategic geography, resource Timbuktu, along with Jin and Gao, housed universities, libraries, and madrasas that drew scholars from across the Islamic world. Manuscripts on law, astronomy, medicine, and theology flourished, creating one of Africa's earliest centers of learning. Trade continued to underpin Mali's wealth. Gold, salt, ivory, and enslaved people flowed through caravan networks, connecting Mali to North Africa, the Middle East, and even Mediterranean Europe. By controlling both production and trade, Mali could project power over vast territories, sustain large armies, and sponsor monumental architecture, including mosques and palaces that remain symbols of the empire's sophistication. Mali's governance model combined centralized authority with respect for local institutions. Provincial governors, often drawn from royal or noble lineages, administered justice, collected taxes, and oversaw military obligations. This balance allowed the empire to maintain control over diverse populations, including Mande, Songhai, Fulani, and Tuareg communities, while integrating Islamic principles alongside indigenous religious practices. Islam, while increasingly influential under Mansa Musa, coexisted with traditional African beliefs, reflecting a pragmatic approach that reinforced political stability and social cohesion. By the mid-14th century, Mali's influence extended across the Niger River basin, encompassing rich agricultural lands, gold-producing regions, and strategic trade routes. The empire's prosperity relied not only on commerce, but also on agricultural innovation. Farmers cultivated millet, sorghum, rice, and cotton, often employing irrigation and crop rotation techniques suited to the Sahelian environment. Livestock herding supplemented farming, providing meat, milk, and labor. This combination of agriculture and trade created a resilient economy capable of supporting a large population and complex social structures. Despite its wealth and sophistication, Mali faced challenges that would eventually weaken the empire. Succession disputes, regional revolts, and the rise of neighboring powers such as the Songhai Empire eroded central authority. By the late 15th century, Mali had lost control of key trade centers like Gao and Timbuktu, leading to a gradual decline in political and economic influence. Nonetheless, the empire's legacy endured. It established models of governance, commerce, scholarship, and urban planning that influenced later West African states, including Songhai, Oyo, and Benin. The histories of Ghana and Mali also illustrate the transformative impact of the trans-Saharan trade on African societies. Caravans of camels carried salt, gold, textiles, and other goods across deserts, linking West Africa to North Africa, the Middle East, and the Mediterranean. These exchanges brought wealth, ideas, and technologies, including literacy, astronomy, and Islamic jurisprudence, reshaping the social, political, and religious landscape of the region. West African empires were therefore not isolated. They were active participants in global networks centuries before European contact. Military organization was equally central to Ghana's and Mali's success. Both empires maintained professional armies capable of defending trade routes, suppressing rebellions, and projecting power regionally. Cavalry units, archers, and infantry were strategically deployed, while fortified towns and garrisons ensured the security of key economic centers. These military capabilities allowed the empires to secure resources, enforce tribute, and maintain stability across vast and diverse territories. Cultural achievements were intertwined with economic and political power. Artisans produced intricate jewelry, metalwork, and textiles, while oral traditions preserved histories, genealogies, and moral instruction. Music, dance, and storytelling reinforced communal identity, transmitting knowledge across generations. In Mali, the integration of Islamic scholarship with indigenous learning created a vibrant intellectual environment that influenced law, education, and governance for centuries. The legacies of Ghana and Mali extend far beyond their immediate borders. They demonstrated that African states could sustain wealth, governance, and culture independently, without reliance on external empires. They also challenged later European narratives that depicted pre-colonial Africa as primitive or static, instead revealing dynamic societies with sophisticated economies, social hierarchies, and cultural production. By the 16th century, these empires had established the blueprint for West African civilization, laying the foundations for the rise of the Songhai Empire, the Oyo and Benin kingdoms, and other states that would dominate the region in the early modern period. By examining Ghana and Mali, we see the importance of geography, resource control, trade, and leadership in shaping enduring African empires. From the wealth of gold mines to the bustling markets of Kumbi Sala and Timbuktu, from the disciplined armies to the thriving centers of scholarship, these empires illustrate the complexity, resilience, and influence of West African civilizations. They remind us that Africa's history is not solely the story of the Nile or the Mediterranean, but encompasses a continent-wide narrative of innovation, adaptation, and interconnectedness. As the Mali Empire gradually waned during the 15th century, the stage was set for a new power to dominate West Africa, the Songhai Empire, circa 1464 to 1591 CE. Rising along the Niger River, the Songhai Empire inherited and expanded upon the commercial and political systems established by Ghana and Mali, controlling key trade networks and fostering centralized administration. Its expansion was both strategic and methodical, balancing military conquest, diplomacy, and economic integration across a vast and diverse territory. The foundation of Songhai's dominance is often attributed to Sunni Ali, r. 1464 to 1492 CE, a formidable military leader whose campaigns consolidated control over the Niger River basin. Sunni Ali extended Songhai's reach to include important cities such as Gao, Timbuktu, and Jen, securing trade routes that were vital for commerce in gold, salt, ivory, and slaves. His military strategy combined cavalry, infantry, and riverine forces, demonstrating an advanced understanding of logistics, terrain, and warfare. Sunni Ali's governance emphasized both central authority and local autonomy. While he maintained overarching control, local leaders were allowed to continue administering their communities under Songhai oversight, ensuring stability across a sprawling empire. Following Sunni Ali, Askia Muhammad I, r. 1493 to 1528 CE, also known as Askia the Great, transformed Songhai into one of the most sophisticated states in pre-modern Africa. He restructured the administration, appointing governors to provinces, creating a hierarchical bureaucracy, and codifying laws based on both Islamic and customary principles. Askia Muhammad undertook a systematic expansion of Songhai's territory, integrating regions such as the Hausa city-states in present-day northern Nigeria, ensuring control over trade routes extending to the Atlantic and deep into the interior of West Africa. By supporting Islamic scholarship, Askia Muhammad strengthened the cultural and religious cohesion of his empire, attracting scholars, architects, and jurists to centers of learning like Timbuktu, which became an intellectual beacon rivaling Cairo and Baghdad. Trade under Songhai was both diverse and extensive. Gold from the southern forests continued to fuel regional and trans-Saharan commerce, while salt mined in the Sahara provided essential preservation and seasoning for both local and international markets. Caravans connected Songhai to North African cities such as Tunis, Fez, and Cairo, linking the empire to Mediterranean and Islamic economies. In addition to trade in goods, Songhai became a hub for knowledge transfer, with scholars writing on theology, law, astronomy, and medicine. Manuscripts from this period, some preserved in the libraries of Timbuktu, illustrate the empire's commitment to literacy, administration, and intellectual development. Alongside the Songhai Empire, smaller but significant kingdoms flourished, reflecting West Africa's political and cultural diversity. The Oyo Empire, circa 1400 to 1896 CE, in present-day southwestern Nigeria, developed a centralized governance system with a king, the Alafin, supported by councils of nobles and local chieftains. Oyo's military, particularly its cavalry, enabled it to exert influence over neighboring territories, controlling trade routes and ensuring political stability. Meanwhile, the Benin Kingdom, circa 1180 to 8, military organization across Songhai and its neighboring states was a critical component of political authority and economic control. Empires and kingdoms deployed standing armies, fortified cities, and strategic garrisons to secure trade routes, enforce tribute, and suppress rebellions. Cavalry units, skilled archers, and infantry formed the backbone of these armies, while riverine forces patrolled the Niger River, protecting commerce and enabling rapid troop movement. Military strength was complemented by diplomatic strategy, marriage alliances, and vassalage, creating a system of layered authority that maintained order across heterogeneous populations. Cultural and religious life in Songhai and the surrounding kingdoms was equally complex. Islam, introduced via trans-Saharan trade, became a unifying force, especially under rulers like Askia Muhammad, who actively promoted Islamic law, scholarship, and institutions. At the same time, traditional beliefs persisted, influencing rituals, social hierarchies, and communal governance. This duality reflects a broader West African pattern. African societies often blended indigenous practices with external influences, creating syncretic cultures that were uniquely African yet globally connected. Economically, West African empires demonstrated remarkable sophistication. Songhai, Oyo, Benin, and the Hausa city-states maintained extensive markets, regulated trade, and developed specialized crafts. Artisans produced textiles, metalwork, pottery, and jewelry, often tied to guild-like organizations that ensured quality, training, and economic stability. Agricultural systems supported urban populations, with millet, sorghum, rice, and yams cultivated using techniques adapted to local climates. Livestock provided food, labor, and trade goods, while the management of water resources and irrigation reflected advanced knowledge of environmental adaptation. The interplay of trade, governance, and culture also positioned these empires within larger global networks. Gold and ivory from West Africa reached North Africa and Europe, while salt, cola nuts, and textiles circulated widely across the Sahara and into the Mediterranean. Scholars, merchants, and religious leaders traveled these routes, transmitting knowledge, ideas, and technologies. In essence, West African empires were not isolated. They actively engaged with the broader Afro-Eurasian world, shaping and being shaped by long-distance interactions that predate European colonization. Despite their prosperity and sophistication, these empires faced internal and external pressures. Succession disputes, regional rebellions, and competition for control of trade routes occasionally destabilized states. Environmental challenges, including drought and soil depletion, impacted agricultural production and population stability. Moreover, by the late 16th century, the expansion of European trade along the Atlantic coast began to redirect commerce, setting the stage for profound transformations in West African political and economic structures during the early modern period. By the early 17th century, Songhai had collapsed following the Moroccan invasion in 1591 CE, which utilized firearms to overpower traditional cavalry-based forces. Nevertheless, the empire's administrative models, cultural achievements, and commercial networks influenced subsequent West African polities. Regional kingdoms such as Oyo, Benin, and the Hausa city-states continued to thrive, adapting to new trade dynamics and sustaining urban centers that remained vital to West Africa's social and economic fabric. The histories of Songhai and the regional kingdoms illustrate several enduring themes in West African history: the centrality of trade and political power, the integration of religion and governance, the importance of military organization, and the resilience of African societies in the face of environmental, political, and economic challenges. These empires demonstrate that West Africa was a landscape of dynamic, interconnected civilizations, capable of sustaining complex political systems and vibrant cultures over centuries. In examining this period, it is also evident that African societies were active participants in shaping their own destinies, rather than passive subjects of external forces. Songhai and the regional kingdoms developed internal mechanisms for governance, conflict resolution, and economic regulation, ensuring continuity even in times of crisis. They exemplified adaptive strategies that balanced central authority with local autonomy, blending tradition with innovation to meet the challenges of governance, commerce, and diplomacy. The legacy of West Africa's 15th and 16th century empires extends far beyond the continent. The wealth, culture, and scholarship of these societies reached North Africa, Europe, and the Islamic world, influencing global trade, intellectual exchange, and artistic expression. Manuscripts from Timbuktu and Djenné, for example, continue to provide insights into law, medicine, astronomy, and theology, reflecting centuries of scholarly activity and connecting West African intellectual traditions to broader human history. While West African empires flourished along the Niger River and the Sahel, the Horn of Africa, and the East African coast were also developing sophisticated states, urban centers, and trade networks that connected the continent to the broader Indian Ocean world. The Axumite Empire, c. 100 to 940 CE, located in present-day northern Ethiopia and Eritrea, stands as one of Africa's earliest Christian kingdoms and a formidable hub of commerce, political power, and cultural innovation. Aksum's influence extended across the Ethiopian highlands, the Red Sea coast, and inland trade routes linking Africa to Arabia, India, and beyond. Aksum's origins trace back to the 1st century CE, building upon earlier settlements and kingdoms in the region. By the 3rd and 4th century CE, Aksum had consolidated control over highland and lowland territories, establishing a centralized monarchy with a king known as the Negus. Aksum's rulers exercised both spiritual and temporal authority, legitimizing their rule through claims of divine favor and strategic marriages with neighboring elites. The empire's wealth derived from agriculture, mining, and, most significantly, trade. Aksum controlled access to Red Sea ports such as Adulis, which became gateways for the exchange of ivory, gold, frankincense, myrrh, and exotic animals. These goods flowed from the African interior to Arabia, India, and the Mediterranean, while imports of textiles, spices, and luxury items enriched the elite and fueled urban growth. Aksum's economy was closely tied to its agricultural base. Farmers cultivated grains, pulses, and teff, a staple crop still central to Ethiopian cuisine, using sophisticated terracing and irrigation techniques suited to the highland environment. Livestock, particularly cattle, sheep, and goats, supplemented the diet, provided labor, and formed part of local trade networks. The combination of productive agriculture and control of trade routes enabled Aksum to sustain a substantial population, fund monumental architecture, and maintain a standing army capable of defending the empire and its commercial interests. Politically, Aksum was organized into provinces overseen by governors who reported to the Negus. This administrative system allowed for both centralized decision-making and local governance, ensuring stability across diverse communities. Axumite kings issued coins beginning in the 3rd century CE, minted in gold, silver, and bronze, which facilitated commerce and symbolized royal authority. These coins often bore inscriptions in Guizi, the ancient written language of Ethiopia, as well as Christian symbols following the kingdom's conversion. The introduction of Christianity was a transformative moment in Aksum's history. Under King Ezana, r.c. 330 to 356 CE, Aksum officially adopted Christianity, aligning itself culturally and politically with the broader Christian world. Ezana's inscriptions and coins proclaiming the Christian faith signify the empire's integration into global religious networks and its assertion of a distinct identity. Christianity influenced governance, law, architecture, and education, with churches constructed in stone and wood, reflecting both indigenous building traditions and external stylistic influences. Aksum's religious institutions also facilitated literacy and scholarship, contributing to the intellectual life of the empire. Meanwhile, along the Swahili Coast, a series of city-states, circa 1000 to 1500 CE, political organization along the Swahili Coast varied from city to city. Each city-state maintained autonomy, governed by local elites who regulated trade, adjudicated disputes, and organized defense. Councils of elders, often drawn from merchant and noble families, advised rulers on matters of commerce and governance. Fortifications, such as stone walls, watchtowers, and port defenses, protected these urban centers from piracy and rival states, ensuring the security of maritime trade. Diplomacy with external powers, including Persia, Arabia, and later Portugal, reinforced Swahili autonomy while facilitating access to new goods, technologies, and ideas. Culture in East Africa was deeply intertwined with trade, religion, and urban life. Swahili architecture, characterized by coral stone buildings, intricate wood carvings, and elaborately decorated mosques, reflected both African traditions and Islamic aesthetics. Artisans produced textiles, pottery, and jewelry that were traded locally and internationally. Oral histories, poetry, and storytelling preserved knowledge of commerce, law, and genealogy, while literacy in Arabic facilitated legal documentation, religious scholarship, and correspondence with distant trading partners. The Indian Ocean trade also had profound social and economic implications. Slavery, though often regulated by local norms, became a significant component of the trade network, with enslaved Africans exported to Arabian, Persian, and Indian markets. Gold and ivory trade supported the wealth of inland kingdoms, while urban centers along the coast flourished as hubs of production, commerce, and cultural exchange. The interdependence of inland and coastal societies underscores the integrated nature of African economic systems and their participation in global networks long before European intervention. Despite external pressures and environmental challenges, East African societies demonstrated resilience and adaptability. Aksum, though eventually declining by the 10th century due to trade shifts, environmental degradation, and political fragmentation, left a lasting religious, cultural, and architectural legacy. Similarly, Swahili city-states adapted to the ebb and flow of trade, maintaining autonomy through diplomacy, military preparedness, and cultural cohesion. Their ability to blend indigenous practices with foreign influences allowed these societies to thrive for centuries, illustrating the sophistication and dynamism of East African civilization. The histories of Aksum and the Swahili city-states highlight several enduring patterns. Both relied on strategic geography, controlling key trade routes that connected Africa to regional and global markets. Both combined centralized authority with local governance structures to maintain stability. Both engaged with global religions, Christianity in Aksum and Islam along the Swahili Coast, adapting these beliefs to local contexts while using them to reinforce political legitimacy and social cohesion. Both left lasting cultural, architectural, and intellectual legacies that influenced subsequent African states and societies. While the kingdoms of West and East Africa flourished through trade and scholarship, Southern Africa developed its own complex societies, urban centers, and political hierarchies. Among these, Great Zimbabwe, circa 1100 to 1450 CE, stands as the most remarkable symbol of pre-colonial Southern African civilization. A stone-built city demonstrating advanced engineering, centralized authority, and extensive trade networks. The civilization of Great Zimbabwe emerged in what is now southeastern Zimbabwe, strategically situated near gold-producing regions and fertile lands, enabling both agricultural productivity and engagement with long-distance commerce. Great Zimbabwe's origins are closely tied to the Shona-speaking communities, whose ancestors had settled in the region centuries earlier. By the 11th century CE, they had established agricultural systems, iron smelting technology, and cattle herding practices that formed the economic backbone of their society. These resources underpin the rise of a ruling elite capable of consolidating power, directing labor, and organizing large-scale construction projects. The city of Great Zimbabwe itself, spanning nearly 720 hectares at its peak, was composed of several distinct sections: the hill complex, the great enclosure, and residential areas. Stone walls, some over 11 meters high and constructed without mortar, reflect sophisticated engineering knowledge and a deep understanding of local materials, terrain, and urban planning. Economically, Great Zimbabwe controlled regional trade, particularly in gold, ivory, and cattle, acting as an intermediary between the African interior and coastal trade networks along the Indian Ocean. Goods from the interior, including gold mined in nearby rivers and valleys, were transported to coastal cities such as Sofala, linking southern Africa to the Swahili city-states and, by extension, to Arabia, India, and beyond. This trade brought wealth, prestige, and foreign goods such as ceramics, glass beads, and cloth, which adorned the elite and were used as currency in social and political transactions. The accumulation and redistribution of these resources reinforced social hierarchies and allowed the elite to maintain authority over a diverse population. Cattle played a central role in both the economy and society. Beyond serving as food and labor, cattle symbolized wealth, status, and political legitimacy. The ruling class maintained large herds, using them to reward loyalty, fund trade, and support ritual practices. Agricultural production supplemented cattle herding, with crops such as millet, sorghum, and beans feeding the population and sustaining the labor force necessary for urban construction, trade, and defense. This combination of pastoralism and agriculture created a resilient economy capable of supporting a large, sedentary population and a ruling elite with substantial power. Politically, Great Zimbabwe was governed by a centralized monarchy, with a king exerting authority over subordinate chiefs and local communities. The ruler was not only a political leader, but also a spiritual figure, mediating between the divine and human realms. Ritual and religious practices reinforced royal authority, with shrines, sacred spaces, and ceremonies designed to legitimize the king's rule and ensure the prosperity of the state. The king's court served as a hub for administration, diplomacy, and commerce, coordinating activities across the empire and maintaining ties with both internal and external partners. Art and material culture further illustrate the sophistication of Great Zimbabwe. Soapstone carvings, including the famous Zimbabwe birds, remain iconic symbols of the empire's artistic achievement. Pottery, iron tools, and ornaments indicate high levels of craftsmanship and a structured economy capable of supporting specialized artisans. The integration of art, architecture, and ritual reflects a society in which cultural expression and political power were intertwined, demonstrating the complexity and depth of Southern African civilization. Following the decline of Great Zimbabwe in the mid-15th century, likely due to environmental degradation, overgrazing, and shifts in trade routes, new states and kingdoms emerged in Southern Africa, continuing the region's trajectory of political and economic development. Among these, the Matapa Kingdom, circa 1450 to 1629 CE, situated to the north in modern Zimbabwe and Mozambique, inherited and expanded the trade networks established by Great Zimbabwe. The Matapa rulers controlled gold-rich regions and maintained connections with the Portuguese along the Indian Ocean coast, balancing diplomacy, military force, and trade to sustain authority. Matapa's economy relied on gold mining, agriculture, and cattle herding, with tribute and taxation systems reinforcing centralized governance. In the later centuries, Southern Africa also witnessed the rise of the Nguni-speaking polities, including the Zulu, Xhosa, and Swazi communities, whose political and military structures would later reshape the region. The Zulu Kingdom, under Shaka Zulu, R. 1787 to 1828 CE, exemplifies the integration of military innovation, social reform, and centralized administration. Shaka implemented new tactics, such as the short stabbing spear, Ikawa, and disciplined regimental systems, impis, which enabled the rapid expansion of territory and consolidation of power. His reforms also restructured social organization, integrating conquered groups into a cohesive polity, standardizing age grade systems, and enforcing loyalty through shared military and ritual practices. The rise of Shaka Zulu and other Southern African leaders occurred within a broader context of migration, competition, and ecological change known as the Mfikeng, circa 1815 to 8. The political, economic, and cultural developments of Southern Africa from c. 1100 to the early 19th century underscore several key themes in African history. First, strategic control of resources, whether gold, cattle, or fertile land, enabled the rise of centralized states capable of governing large populations. Second, trade networks, both regional and transoceanic, facilitated wealth accumulation, cultural exchange, and political influence, integrating Southern Africa into global economic systems. Third, social organization, military innovation, and religious or ritual practices reinforced political authority and societal cohesion, ensuring resilience even in times of environmental stress or conflict. The legacy of Great Zimbabwe, the Matapa Kingdom, and later Southern African polities extends far beyond their immediate territories. They demonstrate that Southern Africa, like other regions of the continent, developed complex, centralized societies with sophisticated economies, urban centers, and cultural achievements. These states were active participants in regional and global systems, shaping the flow of trade, ideas, and people long before European colonial powers arrived on the continent. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, Southern African societies had established enduring political and economic frameworks, exemplified by the Zulu kingdom's military and administrative innovations and the Matapa state's control over mineral wealth. These developments illustrate a continuity of statecraft, adaptation to environmental and social pressures, and engagement with broader global networks. Southern Africa's history during this period is a testament to the region's ingenuity, resilience, and influence, challenging misconceptions of pre-colonial Africa as disconnected or static. By the early 15th century, European maritime exploration dramatically reshaped Africa's coastal societies, initiating centuries of contact that would profoundly impact the continent. Portuguese navigators, motivated by trade, religious expansion, and the quest for new routes to Asia, were among the first to establish sustained contact with West, Central, and Southern Africa. Figures such as Prince Henry the Navigator sponsored expeditions along the West African coast, mapping unknown regions, engaging with local polities, and establishing trading posts at strategic locations like Elmina Castle, circa 1482 CE, in present-day Ghana. This marked the beginning of Europe's direct involvement in African commerce, initially focusing on gold, ivory, and spices, but eventually escalating to the transatlantic slave trade. The Portuguese approach combined diplomacy, commerce, and military technology. Along the coast, they formed alliances with African rulers, exchanging firearms, textiles, and luxury goods for gold and other resources. These early interactions were not merely exploitative. African leaders actively negotiated terms, controlled trade routes, and leveraged European demand to consolidate their own power. Coastal kingdoms such as Congo, Benin, and the Kingdom of Ndongo skillfully engaged with European merchants, balancing internal authority with external commerce to enhance wealth and influence. However, these relationships also laid the groundwork for future exploitation, as European powers increasingly sought to dominate trade and extract human and material resources. By the late 15th century, Portuguese and later Dutch, British, and French traders intensified the commerce in enslaved people. The Atlantic slave trade, circa 1500 to 1850, became one of the most consequential and devastating chapters in African history, forcibly relocating millions of Africans to the Americas. The trade was facilitated by African intermediaries, local rulers and merchants, who captured, purchased, or enslaved individuals from neighboring regions, often as a result of warfare, debt, or social hierarchies. Coastal fortresses and trading posts served as collection points, where enslaved people were held before embarking on the Middle Passage, a brutal voyage across the Atlantic marked by inhumane conditions, disease, and high mortality rates. The impact of the Atlantic slave trade on African societies was profound and multifaceted. Economically, it altered traditional production systems, redirected labor, and fueled militarization. Kingdoms such as Dahomey, Asante, and Oyo expanded their military capabilities to capture and control human resources, integrating the trade into state finance and political strategy. The Asante Empire, in particular, benefited from European firearms and textiles, using these resources to consolidate power over surrounding regions. Yet, the trade also destabilized many societies, as population loss, internal conflicts, and shifts in settlement patterns undermined social cohesion and economic resilience. Culturally and demographically, the slave trade reshaped African communities. Entire generations were removed, disrupting family structures, political succession, and social networks. At the same time, the exposure to European goods, technologies, and ideas introduced new dynamics into African societies. Firearms, for example, transformed warfare and political hierarchies, while textiles, beads, and metals became symbols of status, wealth, and authority. Religion and education were influenced as well, with Catholic and Protestant missionaries accompanying traders, establishing schools, and converting some communities, though Islam remained dominant in many West and East African regions, particularly along trans-Saharan and Indian Ocean trade routes. The trade also had significant consequences for gender and social roles. Women, often captured or affected by the loss of male family members, experienced shifts in labor responsibilities, political influence, and social status. Men were conscripted into armies, forced into labor, or displaced by migration and warfare. This demographic disruption had long-term effects on population growth, settlement patterns, and social structures, reverberating across the continent for centuries. European contact extended beyond trade to territorial ambitions and early colonization. Portuguese explorers along the West and East African coasts established fortified settlements to secure their economic interests and assert control over strategic points. On the West African coast, Elmina Castle served both as a trading hub and as a military outpost, allowing the Portuguese to monitor and regulate commerce. In southern Africa, Portuguese settlements in Mozambique and along the Swahili Coast integrated into existing trade networks, navigating complex relationships with local polities. These early colonial footholds were limited in territorial reach but introduced new political and military pressures, setting the stage for more extensive European intervention in later centuries. While European involvement initially focused on the coast, the demand for enslaved labor in the Americas incentivized deeper penetration into the African interior. African states that controlled key inland trade routes gained wealth and influence, while others suffered from raids, displacement, and instability. Kingdoms like Dahomey centralized authority and developed specialized military forces to maintain control over both trade and territory. Similarly, the Asante and Oyo empires expanded their influence through military campaigns and diplomatic alliances, demonstrating the adaptive capacity of African polities in response to external pressures. The human cost of the Atlantic slave trade cannot be overstated. Historians estimate that between 12 and 15 million Africans were forcibly transported to the Americas, with countless more dying during capture, transit, or as a result of societal upheaval. Entire regions experienced depopulation, altering settlement patterns, agriculture, and political organization. Yet, despite this devastation, African societies demonstrated remarkable resilience, maintaining cultural continuity, adapting to new economic realities, and resisting European encroachment in numerous ways. Resistance to the slave trade manifested in multiple forms, from passive evasion to organized rebellion. Enslaved Africans resisted through escape, sabotage, and cultural preservation, while African states occasionally confronted European powers militarily or through diplomatic negotiation. The Kingdom of Congo, under rulers such as King Afonso I, R. 1506 to 1543 CE, sought to navigate Portuguese influence, regulating the trade while attempting to maintain sovereignty and social order. In other regions, coastal and inland communities relocated or reorganized to minimize disruption, illustrating the agency of African societies even under extreme external pressures. Despite the destructive aspects of the trade, it also catalyzed innovation and adaptation. African states developed new forms of taxation, tribute systems, and administrative structures to manage commerce, integrating European goods and wealth into local economies. Urban centers along the coast expanded, serving as hubs for trade, craft production, and cultural exchange. Artistic and cultural expression continued to flourish, with artisans producing textiles, metalwork, and ceramics that were the end of the transatlantic slave trade in the mid-19th century, accelerated by European abolition movements and changing economic priorities, marked a profound transition in African history. While the formal trade declined, the social, economic, and political legacies of centuries of slavery persisted. Coastal societies, inland polities, and diaspora communities all bore the imprint of the trade, shaping the patterns of resistance, adaptation, and transformation that would define the continent's encounter with colonialism in the late 19th century. The mid-19th century marked a pivotal turning point in African history. While European involvement had long been limited to coastal trade and limited inland contact, the advent of industrialization, nationalism, and technological innovation in Europe transformed these interactions into full-scale colonization. Driven by the desire for raw materials markets and strategic advantage, European powers embarked on the scramble for Africa, circa 1884 to 1885, formalized at the Berlin Conference, where the continent was divided into spheres of influence without regard for ethnic, cultural, or political boundaries. This period witnessed the establishment of European administrative control, the imposition of colonial economies, and widespread African resistance. Colonial penetration was facilitated by advances in military technology, including firearms, artillery, and steamships, which gave European powers a decisive advantage over many African armies. However, the continent's diverse societies responded in a multitude of ways, demonstrating agency, resilience, and strategic ingenuity. Resistance took many forms, ranging from organized military opposition to cultural preservation, diplomacy, and localized rebellion. African leaders navigated a complex landscape, balancing the threats posed by European expansion with internal political dynamics and pre-existing rivalries. In southern Africa, the Zulu kingdom, under leaders following Shaka Zulu's innovations, became one of the most formidable opponents of European expansion. The Anglo-Zulu War of 1879 exemplifies African military resilience. Initially, the Zulu achieved a significant victory at the Battle of Isanilwana, where well-coordinated infantry, utilizing disciplined formations and tactical ingenuity, annihilated a British column equipped with superior firearms. Despite this success, technological disparity, logistics, and attrition eventually enabled British forces to capture the Zulu territories. Nevertheless, the war highlighted the capacity of African states to mobilize strategically against a technologically advanced adversary. Further north, the Mahdist Sudan, circa 1881 to 1898, offers another example of determined resistance to European intrusion. Under Muhammad Ahmad al-Mahdi, the Mahdists united various Sudanese groups against Egyptian and British control. The movement combined religious fervor, political mobilization, and military discipline to establish the Mahdist state, defeating Anglo-Egyptian forces in several campaigns, including the famous capture of Khartoum in 1885. The Mahdists implemented administrative systems, taxation, and military organization, illustrating African innovation in governance under extraordinary pressure. Though eventually defeated by General Kitchener's forces in 1898 at the Battle of Omdurman, the Mahdist resistance remains a testament to the strategic, political, and spiritual agency of African societies. In West Africa, the expansion of European influence prompted both accommodation and armed resistance. The Asani Empire, one of the most powerful states in the region, confronted British encroachment in a series of Anglo-Asani wars, 1823 to 1900. Asante armies, leveraging knowledge of terrain, sophisticated logistics, and disciplined infantry formations, repeatedly challenged British advances. While successive defeats gradually eroded Asani's sovereignty, the empire maintained internal cohesion and cultural integrity, negotiating treaties that preserved aspects of governance and social order. Similarly, in the Hausa city-states and Sokoto Caliphate, local leaders navigated the threat of European expansion through diplomacy, strategic alliances, and resistance campaigns, demonstrating adaptability in the face of overwhelming external pressure. Central Africa also witnessed significant resistance. The Herero and Namakwa uprisings, 1904 to 1908, in German Southwest Africa, modern Namibia, reflected profound opposition to European colonial expropriation of land, labor, and resources. German settlers and military forces had increasingly seized fertile land for agriculture and imposed forced labor systems on indigenous communities. In response, the Herero, under Samuel Maharero, and the Namakwa, under Hendrik Witbooi, initiated coordinated uprisings. Though brutally suppressed through systematic genocide and concentration camps, marking one of the first 20th century genocides, the rebellions demonstrated organized resistance, military strategy, and the assertion of indigenous sovereignty. Ethiopia remains one of the most remarkable examples of African resilience during this period. Unlike most African states, Ethiopia successfully maintained independence despite European expansion. Under Emperor Menelik II, R. 1889 to 1913, Ethiopia modernized its military, incorporating firearms, artillery, and strategic intelligence. At the Battle of Adwa in 1896, Ethiopian forces decisively defeated the Italian army, preserving sovereignty and signaling to the world that African states could successfully resist European colonization. The victory at Adwa became a symbol of African agency, nationalism, and military competence, inspiring anti-colonial movements across the continent. Beyond military resistance, African societies employed cultural and diplomatic strategies to preserve autonomy. Traditional political structures, religious institutions, and social networks were leveraged to maintain authority under the pressures of colonial encroachment. Leaders engaged in treaty negotiations, selectively adopted European technologies, and utilized local knowledge to navigate economic and political transformations. In many regions, African rulers retained partial control over taxation, legal systems, and trade, using these levers to mitigate the full impact of colonial administration. These adaptations illustrate the complexity of African engagement with imperialism, challenging narratives of passive submission. Economically, colonial policies sought to extract raw materials for European markets, often restructuring African economies to serve metropolitan interests. Cash crops, mineral exploitation, and forced labor systems were implemented to maximize European profit. Infrastructure projects, railroads, ports, and telegraph lines facilitated resource extraction but were designed primarily to benefit colonial economies rather than local development. These economic transformations disrupted traditional production, altered settlement patterns, and created social inequalities. Yet African communities found ways to resist, adapt, and retain cultural identity in the face of coercion. The imposition of colonial law and governance varied across regions, reflecting the diverse strategies employed by European powers. The British system of indirect rule, for example, maintained existing local hierarchies while subordinating them to colonial administration. In contrast, French assimilation policies sought to integrate African populations into a French cultural and legal framework, eroding indigenous authority. German and Portuguese approaches often combined direct military control with economic exploitation. Across all these systems, African actors navigated colonial structures to their advantage when possible, negotiating authority, leveraging trade, and preserving social networks. Religion and culture played a central role in resistance and adaptation. African spiritual practices, Islam, and Christianity served as sources of identity, cohesion, and political legitimacy. Religious institutions provided organizational frameworks for social and political action, education, and the preservation of history. Missionary activity introduced European education and literacy, yet African communities selectively integrated these elements into indigenous frameworks, producing hybrid systems that reinforced cultural resilience. By the early 20th century, the colonization of Africa was largely complete, yet resistance continued in various forms. Guerrilla warfare, revolts, cultural preservation, and economic adaptation illustrated the persistence of African agency under colonial domination. While European powers controlled territory during World War I, 1914 to 1918, African participation was extensive. Colonial powers, including Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, and Portugal, relied on African soldiers, porters, and laborers to support campaigns both within Africa and abroad. In German East Africa, modern Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi, the war became a protracted struggle between German colonial forces and Allied troops, including British, Belgian, and Portuguese forces. Under the leadership of General Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck, German troops employed guerrilla tactics that tied down significantly larger Allied forces, relying heavily on African soldiers known as askaris. African troops displayed extraordinary endurance, adaptability, and strategic skill, navigating challenging terrain, disease, and supply shortages to sustain resistance. Although the campaign ultimately ended with German surrender in 1918, African contributions were indispensable to both sides and came at great human cost. West Africa also played a crucial role. The West African Frontier Force, WAFF, composed of soldiers from British colonies such as Nigeria, Gold Coast, modern Ghana, Sierra Leone, and Gambia, was deployed to campaigns in Cameroon, East Africa, and Europe. French West African troops, known as tirailleurs sénégalais, served in Europe and the Middle East, participating in battles that ranged from the trenches of northern France to the deserts of the Middle East. These soldiers faced harsh conditions, racial discrimination, and high mortality, yet their involvement exposed them to modern military organization, global politics, and ideas of citizenship and rights, which would later inspire post-war political activism and nationalist movements. The war also transformed African economies and societies. Colonial administrations demanded food, labor, and resources to sustain military campaigns, leading to forced requisitions, increased taxation, and labor conscription. Cash crops were often diverted to feed armies and sustain colonial economies, disrupting subsistence agriculture and creating food shortages in local communities. Infrastructure projects, including roads, railways, and ports, expanded during wartime to support troop movement and resource extraction, leaving enduring legacies in transportation and trade networks. However, these developments primarily served colonial interests, reinforcing the economic extraction and exploitation of African territories. World War I also exacerbated existing political tensions. Wartime labor demands, conscription, and resource expropriation fueled grievances against colonial administrations. In some regions, these tensions erupted into uprisings, such as the Maji-Maji Rebellion, 1905 to 1907, in German East Africa, which, though preceding World War I, set a precedent for African resistance. During the war itself, the mobilization of African troops and exposure to European political ideologies planted the seeds of nationalist consciousness, as soldiers returned with new perspectives on governance, equality, and self-determination. These returning veterans often became leaders or supporters of early anti-colonial movements, bridging local struggles with global political ideas. Following World War I, the Treaty of Versailles, 1919, redrew African territorial boundaries, transferring German colonies to Britain, France, and Belgium under League of Nations mandates. These changes intensified European control while marginalizing indigenous authority. German colonies such as Togoland and Cameroon were divided between British and French administration, while Southwest Africa, modern Namibia, came under South African mandate. The post-war settlement, while appearing to stabilize European interests, ignored African agency and territorial claims, further fueling discontent and setting the stage for future resistance. World War II, 1939 to 1945, again mobilized Africa on a massive scale. Colonial powers enlisted millions of Africans as soldiers, laborers, and porters. The King's African Rifles, KR, in British East Africa, the French colonial forces, and the Force Publique in Belgian Congo served in campaigns across North Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. The North African Campaign, 1940 to 1943, became a critical theater, with African soldiers fighting in Libya, Egypt, and Tunisia. Their knowledge of desert terrain, adaptability, and resilience under extreme conditions contributed decisively to Allied operations, often underappreciated in contemporary historical accounts. The war introduced new technologies and strategies that affected African societies. Mechanized warfare, aviation, and modern logistics exposed African troops and civilians to global military innovations, while the strategic importance of African resources, such as copper, tin, uranium, and rubber, increased dramatically. For example, uranium from the Belgian Congo played a crucial role in the Manhattan Project, illustrating Africa's global significance in wartime economies. These developments further integrated African colonies into global supply chains, while simultaneously highlighting the exploitative nature of colonial extraction. World War II also accelerated political consciousness and nationalist sentiment. Africans witnessed both the rhetoric of freedom and democracy promoted by colonial powers and the stark contradictions of colonial domination at home. Soldiers returning from Europe and North Africa brought first-hand experiences of racial hierarchies, industrialized societies, and political movements that emphasized self-determination and human rights. These experiences catalyzed the post-war wave of anti-colonial activism, as veterans became influential leaders and organizers in movements seeking independence and social reform. Resistance to colonial control continued during the wars, though often suppressed by military and administrative authority. In some regions, covert acts of defiance, such as sabotage, evasion of conscription, and strikes, demonstrated ongoing African agency. Urban centers and rural communities alike navigated wartime pressures, balancing survival with subtle forms of political negotiation. Traditional authorities sometimes leveraged wartime circumstances to assert local autonomy or mediate between colonial administrations and their subjects, reflecting complex social and political dynamics. The economic impact of the world wars also shaped Africa's trajectory. Wartime production, forced labor, and resource extraction accelerated urbanization and monetization of local economies. Cash crops, mining, and infrastructure projects expanded under colonial supervision, creating new labor demands and fostering migration from rural to urban centers. This economic transformation reshaped social hierarchies, created new class dynamics, and exposed African societies to the challenges of industrialized economies, laying the groundwork for post-war economic and political activism. Furthermore, African participation in the world wars highlighted the interconnectedness of global and local histories. Conflicts fought thousands of miles away had immediate consequences for African communities, economies, and polities. Soldiers and laborers, once drawn into global military networks, returned with skills, networks, and perspectives that would inform the strategies of anti-colonial movements. The wars underscored the continent's strategic and economic importance, challenging narratives that marginalized Africa in global history and emphasizing its centrality in shaping modern world events. By the end of World War II in 1945, Africa had been fundamentally transformed. Millions of Africans had served in military capacities, contributing to the defeat of fascism and the Axis powers. The social, economic, and political effects of wartime mobilization had left colonies both more integrated into global systems and more politically conscious. African societies had experienced intensified resource extraction, urbanization, and exposure to global ideas, while simultaneously maintaining cultural practices, political structures, and local networks. The contradictions of fighting for freedom abroad while living under colonial subjugation fueled determination for self-rule, creating the foundation for the independence movements that would sweep the continent in the following decades. The conclusion of World War II in 1945 marked the beginning of a new chapter in African history. Having contributed millions of soldiers, laborers, and resources to the Allied war effort, African populations returned home with heightened political awareness, new organizational skills, and exposure to ideas of self-determination and equality. The contradictions of fighting for freedom abroad while remaining under colonial domination ignited widespread nationalist movements, accelerating the path toward independence. Between 1945 and the 1960s, similarly, in Senegal, Leopold Sédar Senghor led the movement for political autonomy within the French West African framework. As a poet, intellectual, and politician, Senghor emphasized cultural identity, education, and gradual political reform, advocating for independence through negotiation and institution building. Senegal achieved independence in 1960, contributing to a wave of decolonization across French West Africa, which included countries such as Mali, the Ivory Coast, and Burkina Faso. These movements demonstrated a combination of diplomacy, mass mobilization, and intellectual leadership, illustrating that African independence could emerge through both activism and negotiation. In East Africa, nationalist movements were often intertwined with resistance to settler dominance and land dispossession. In Kenya, the struggle against British colonial rule escalated into the Mau Mau Uprising, 1952 to 1960, a violent confrontation rooted in grievances over land alienation, forced labor, and political marginalization. Kikuyu communities organized guerrilla campaigns in the highlands, challenging British military and administrative authority. Despite brutal repression, including mass detention, executions, and forced relocation, the uprising exposed the untenability of colonial rule and laid the groundwork for eventual independence. Jomo Kenyatta, a leading figure in the Kenyan independence movement, utilized international diplomacy, political organization, and negotiation to secure sovereignty for Kenya in 1963, illustrating the multifaceted strategies of decolonization. Northern African countries also pursued independence through both negotiation and armed struggle. In Algeria, for instance, the National Liberation Front, FLN, initiated a protracted and brutal war of independence against French colonial authorities from 1954 to 1962. The conflict involved guerrilla warfare, urban insurgency, and widespread civilian participation, reflecting the high stakes and intensity of anti-colonial struggle in regions with significant settler populations. Algeria's eventual independence in 1962 marked the culmination of one of the most violent and transformative liberation movements in African history, highlighting the spectrum of strategies, from diplomacy to armed struggle, employed by African peoples to reclaim sovereignty. In southern Africa, the dynamics of decolonization were complex due to settler-dominated territories and entrenched racial hierarchies. In South Africa, the apartheid system, formalized in 1948, delayed independence for the majority population, embedding systemic racial discrimination and segregation. Nonetheless, African political movements, including the African National Congress, ANC, and other liberation organizations, engaged in long-term activism, strikes, and eventually armed resistance, creating the foundation for the eventual dismantling of colonial and minority rule decades later. Similarly, in Rhodesia, modern Zimbabwe, nationalist movements began organizing during this period. Although formal independence would not be achieved until the late 20th century, demonstrating the variability of decolonization timelines across regions. The role of intellectuals, students, and diasporic communities was also pivotal. African leaders educated in Europe and the Americas, such as Nnamdi Azikiwe in Nigeria, Patrice Lumumba in the Congo, and Ahmed Sékou Touré in Guinea, combined exposure to global political thought with local grievances to articulate visions for sovereignty. Universities, newspapers, and cultural associations became platforms for political mobilization, fostering awareness of colonial injustices and encouraging participation in nationalist campaigns. The circulation of ideas across borders facilitated a Pan-African consciousness, linking struggles in one region to those across the continent. International factors further influenced the trajectory of decolonization. The Cold War, emerging superpower rivalries, and shifting economic priorities affected European colonial policies, creating openings for negotiation and accelerated independence. The United Nations promotion of anti-colonial principles provided both a moral and diplomatic framework, pressuring colonial powers to reconsider prolonged occupation. African leaders leveraged these global shifts, using international forums to highlight colonial injustices, gain support, and legitimize their claims to sovereignty. Economically, the post-war period challenged European colonial exploitation. Colonial administrations had extracted labor, resources, and taxes for decades, but the logistical and financial burdens of maintaining control became increasingly unsustainable. African societies, having been integrated into global wartime economies, were better positioned to demand economic reforms, access to education, and participation in governance. The combination of local activism, economic pressure, and global political shifts created a confluence of factors that enabled the rapid spread of independence across the continent. By the early 1960s, the pace of decolonization accelerated dramatically. Countries across sub-Saharan Africa, from Nigeria, 1960, to Tanzania, 1961, Uganda, 1962, Congo, 1960, and Senegal, 1960, achieved independence, redefining political and territorial arrangements. This wave of sovereignty was unprecedented in scale and speed, reflecting the culmination of decades of activism, intellectual leadership, and social mobilization. The newly independent states faced enormous challenges, including nation-building, economic development, and reconciliation among diverse ethnic, linguistic, and religious communities, but the achievement of political independence represented a historic reclamation of African agency and dignity. The decolonization period also catalyzed Pan-African movements. Leaders such as Nkrumah, Senghor, and Azikiwe advocated for continental unity, regional cooperation, and the promotion of African identity on the global stage. Culturally, the independence movements revitalized African identity, history, and heritage. The struggle against colonial domination reinvigorated interest in pre-colonial histories, languages, and traditions, contributing to national narratives that emphasized continuity, resilience, and self-determination. Educational reforms, cultural institutions, and media became tools to reconstruct collective memory and assert the legitimacy of African civilizations long marginalized under European narratives. This cultural revival reinforced the political achievements of independence, creating a holistic framework for post-colonial development. The 1960s marked both the culmination of Africa's long struggle against colonial domination and the beginning of a new chapter defined by sovereignty, nation-building, and the assertion of African identity on the global stage. After centuries of empires, trade networks, external invasions, and colonial exploitation, the continent had entered a period in which the political, social, and cultural agency of its peoples could be exercised more fully. Yet this period was not merely a celebration of independence. It was also an era of immense challenges. as newly sovereign states navigated the complex legacies of history while forging new pathways for development, governance, and continental unity. By the mid-1960s, most of sub-Saharan Africa had achieved independence. Internationally, newly independent African states navigated a complex geopolitical landscape. The Cold War presented both risks and opportunities, as the United States and the Soviet Union sought influence in Africa through economic aid, military support, and ideological engagement. African leaders, aware of the dangers of external domination, often pursued policies of non-alignment, exemplified by the Bandung Conference, 1955, and the subsequent non-aligned movement, seeking to assert African agency without being subsumed by superpower rivalries. African diplomacy in this period reflected both pragmatic engagement and principled advocacy for sovereignty, human rights, and economic development on the global stage. The legacies of historical empires, trade networks, and regional interactions were evident in the post-independence era. Northern African countries, with their centuries-long experience under Islamic governance and Mediterranean trade, integrated religious and cultural institutions into governance and education. West African nations drew upon centuries of experience in the Ghana, Mali, and Songhai empires to structure political organization, trade regulation, and cultural revival. East African nations, including Kenya, Tanzania, and Ethiopia, combined indigenous governance systems with modern administrative structures, reflecting a synthesis of historical continuity and innovation. Southern African states confronted the legacies of settler colonialism, land dispossession, and racial hierarchies, necessitating prolonged struggles for social and economic justice that would extend well beyond the 1960s. The end of formal colonial rule did not eliminate external influence. Economic dependence, international debt, and foreign investment continued to shape African development. Multinational corporations and former colonial powers retained significant leverage over resources, trade, and policy. Nevertheless, African states increasingly exercised political sovereignty, establishing embassies, joining international organizations, and negotiating treaties that affirmed their status as autonomous actors in global affairs. This period demonstrated that independence was both an achievement and a starting point, requiring continued engagement with the legacies of history and the demands of the modern world. Socially, independence inspired transformative movements in education, urbanization, and social mobilization. Expanding access to schooling, particularly higher education, created a new generation of African professionals, scholars, and leaders equipped to manage post-colonial states. Urban centers grew rapidly, integrating diverse populations and fostering economic activity, cultural exchange, and political engagement. Women's movements gained momentum, advocating for participation in governance, education, and economic development, reflecting a broader understanding of citizenship and rights in the post-colonial context. These social transformations were rooted in both historical precedent and contemporary necessity, emphasizing the agency and innovation of African societies. The 1960s also witnessed the consolidation of continental institutions aimed at cooperation and conflict resolution. The Organization of African Unity, OAU, established in 1963, provided a platform for addressing territorial disputes, supporting liberation movements in territories still under colonial or minority rule, and promoting economic and cultural collaboration. The OAU's founding principles emphasized respect for sovereignty, non-interference, and collective security, reflecting lessons drawn from both pre-colonial alliances and colonial-era fragmentation. Pan-African networks fostered solidarity, shared strategies, and coordinated diplomacy, reinforcing the interconnectedness of African states and their shared historical experiences. Culturally, the post-independence era reaffirmed the significance of Africa's historical contributions to global civilization. Art, literature, and music drew upon pre-colonial traditions, Islamic scholarship, and colonial-era experiences to create distinct national identities while engaging with global currents. Scholars revisited African history, emphasizing the achievements of ancient Egypt, the empires of Mali, Songhai, and Great Zimbabwe, and the resilience of African societies under colonialism. Museums, archives, and educational curricula were developed to preserve memory, instill pride, and counter narratives of African inferiority imposed during the colonial period. This intellectual and cultural revival served as both a tool for nation-building and a bridge connecting contemporary African societies to their historical foundations. Yet, the transition to independence was not without challenges. Ethnic tensions, border disputes, economic inequalities, and governance difficulties confronted many new states. Arbitrary colonial borders often forced the integration of diverse ethnic, linguistic, and religious communities into single political entities, creating pressures that required careful negotiation and institution building. Political parties, social organizations, and local leaders played crucial roles in mediating these tensions, promoting dialogue, and establishing frameworks for governance that balanced unity with diversity. These efforts reflected a continuity of African political sophistication, drawing upon pre-colonial governance traditions, colonial administrative experience, and new post-colonial realities. By the late 1960s, the African continent had been transformed from a patchwork of colonized territories into a mosaic of independent nations, each with distinct identities yet linked by shared histories of resilience, resistance, and adaptation. The lessons of the past, ranging from the administrative sophistication of ancient Egypt and the Mali Empire to the strategic resistance of Ethiopia, the Zulu Kingdom, and the Mahdiist Sudan, continued to inform political, economic, and cultural development. Africa's historical trajectory underscored the persistence of agency, innovation, and adaptation in the face of external pressures, demonstrating that the continent's story was both unique and integral to the broader narrative of human civilization. In conclusion, the legacy of Africa's recorded history, culminating in the 1960s, is multifaceted. It encompasses political independence, cultural renaissance, economic transformation, social mobilization, and international engagement. The continent's journey from the unification of Egypt around 3100 BCE, through centuries of empires, trade networks, European incursions, resistance, and colonization, to the achievement of sovereign states, reflects a persistent thread of resilience, innovation, and global significance. The 1960s represent not only the end of formal colonial rule, but also the beginning of an era in which African societies could define their destinies, reinterpret their histories, and assert their place on the world stage. Africa's story, therefore, is not merely a chronicle of the past. It is a foundation for understanding contemporary global dynamics and the ongoing quest for self-determination, justice, and cultural affirmation. The post-independence period also established the framework for contemporary African engagement with the world. African states became active participants in the United Nations, regional organizations, and international economic systems, asserting sovereignty while navigating global interdependence. Cultural exchange, diplomatic negotiation, and economic strategy all drew upon historical experiences of trade, empire, and resistance, illustrating the continuity of African agency across millennia. The legacies of ancient and medieval empires, colonial encounters, and wartime mobilization converged to shape the continent's modern identity, highlighting the enduring relevance of Africa's historical trajectory. Ultimately, the history of Africa up to the 1960s reveals a continent characterized by complexity, resilience, and profound influence. From the architectural genius of the pyramids to the intellectual vibrancy of Timbuktu, From the strategic military campaigns of Ottawa and Isanwana to the grassroots activism that fueled independence movements, Africa's recorded history offers a narrative of agency, innovation, and enduring significance. This legacy continues to inform contemporary African societies and global understanding of the continent, asserting that Africa's story is central not only to its own people, but to the shared history of humanity.